Good evening, BookTube. It's been a while, it's been an awful long time since my last video. A large part of that has been due to events over the water in the United States of America, where the American people, in their manifest wisdom, have taken it upon themselves to elect a convicted criminal, an adjudicated rapist, a felon, a racist, sexist, and quasi-fascist to the highest office in the land, which is the presidency of the United States. And I have been frantically keeping up with the news. Not a day goes by when we aren't being bombarded with the latest news of the most recent outrageous appointment that Donald Trump has made to his cabinet. And it seems, folks, that we are in for a real freak show, given the colourful characters that have been displayed so far for the perusal of the Senate, which is meant to confirm these candidates for office, these nominations, and in theory is supposed to vet them before they are appointed. Whether the spineless, supine, increasingly cowardly Republican Party in this current time in American politics will do that and will stand by its constitutional obligations to do so is unclear. But I will leave that to the judgment of the people who are watching this video. Again, apologies for the length of time. I have just gotten so caught up with work on the one hand and news on the other that I haven't been able to put aside any real time to dedicate to making videos. But now I'm back, and the book I have been reading this week, and which I have just finished, is The Last Shah by Takeyh. This is part of Non-Fiction November, the month where on BookTube we celebrate and encourage the reading of non-fiction. The idea behind it is that if you are someone who doesn't typically read non-fiction, that you should aim to read more of it. And if you already read a lot of non-fiction, the challenge is very much to only read non-fiction and nothing else. Now, this is something I've not actually stuck to myself, because I have been spending a lot of time rereading Dostoevsky, and as part of that, I recently read the magnificent Michael Katz translation, the most recent translation of the Brothers Karamazov, that came out last year actually, and was reviewed by Steve Donahue for Open Letters. So I may do a video on that, talking about my experience with the book and with that particular translation, which I think I'm justified in saying is probably the best translation that has so far been done, although I'm quite fond of the AFSI translation as well, so they're probably both tied in terms of which translation I like the most. But the Katz translation I can highly recommend, as it's a very strong translation. I think it manages to capture so much of what I love about Dostoevsky, whilst also modernizing those bits which are harder, perhaps, for a modern audience to understand. And it's certainly much easier to read than Constance Garnett's somewhat clunkier prose. Garnett, of course, was an Edwardian, and she had a particular way with the language, which might not be to the taste of contemporaries. Personally, I'm quite fond of her translations, as dated as they are. They are how I first got into Dostoevsky. But moving on from Dostoevsky for now, I would like to discuss The Last Shah by Takeyh, who I believe is an Iranian-American academic, and this was actually published fairly recently, in 2018. The last Shah has always fascinated me. He was the last monarch of an ancient monarchy that lasted for something like 2,500 years. The downfall of this monarchy was catastrophic for not just Iran, but the entire region. It was sudden. It was unfortunately foreseeable. And Ray Takeyh, in this book, does a magnificent job of pointing out just how foreseeable this was. He has a deep knowledge of the primary sources in question, in particular of a lot of the CIA reports that were being compiled about Iran at this time and about its rather megalomaniacal ruler and autocrat, the last Shah, Mohammad Reza. And they were quite knowledgeable, actually, about the situation, given a lot of the dirt which has been thrown at them by a lot of historians and a lot of commentators about this period in world history and indeed in Iranian history. And they have been made the scapegoat for a lot of what went wrong in 1979. But what Ray Takeyh makes clear in this book is that American politicians and people who went to the country and observed it very closely clearly could see signs that something was wrong. The Shah of Iran came to power in 1941 after the Allies during World War II had invaded Iran and deposed his father, the first Shah of the Pahlavi dynasty, Reza Shah, who came to power having ousted the previous dynasty, the Qajar dynasty of Iran, which had overseen a decline in the country's fortunes. So Reza Shah, who was an army officer, who then rose to become prime minister and then seized power as the first Pahlavi Shah, made it his goal to modernize the country and to drag his country kicking and screaming into the light of modernity. So Takeyh discusses the first few pages the nature of his rule, rather brutal and thuggish as it was, and he also spends some time discussing his sudden downfall at the hands of the Allied powers when they invaded Iran in 1941. The justification for this invasion was Reza Shah's pro-German tendencies and the fear the Allies had that Iranian oil might fall into the hands of the Germans. There was also the desire to secure Iran as a base for supplying the Soviet Union, which at that time was in a fight for its very existence against the Nazi juggernaut. So both Britain and Russia launched a joint invasion in 1941, which cut the country in two, effectively, and left Iran, which had long been the subject of a great power tussle between these two countries, effectively at the mercy of foreign powers. Now, the Pahlavi dynasty could easily have been deposed at this point. Reza Shah had made a lot of enemies. His modernization program had alienated large parts of the country. And what saved the dynasty, or dynasty, depending on how you prefer to pronounce it, in the end was, as Takeyh makes clear, the Iranian political elite, who felt that the old dynasty had no real popular support or roots in the population anymore, and that the best bet for Iran was to remain with its newfangled dynasty and to appoint Reza Shah's son, his eldest son, Mohammad Reza, as the new Shah. So he was recognized by the Allied powers with some reluctance as the new Shah. His father was carted off into exile, and the new Shah spent the first several years of his reign essentially taking a back seat to the real work of governance that was being done by his ministers, by his cabinet, by Parliament, and of course by the Allied powers, who were the real power at that time in Iran. It wasn't really until after World War II that the Shah started to play a more important role in world affairs. Takeyh narrates the very important role that the Iranian political class played during this time. In particular, some of the key prime ministers who were the real rulers of the country, as opposed to the Shah, who remained a backroom player for a large part of this period. Despite the somewhat misleading title of this book, this is less a book about the Shah and more a book about Iran in general, and about Iranian politics in the 20th century. Now, it wasn't until 1953 that the Shah actually seized the reins of government for himself. And the opportunity arose when a very popular, rather brash, nationalistic politician called Mohammad Mossadegh became prime minister. Now, the controversy surrounding this figure, especially surrounding his eventual overthrow, is very heated and is still a bone of contention to this day. And the catalyst for his eventual overthrow was his decision in 1951 to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company and take Iran's oil into the possession of the Iranian people. Now, this led to a boycott from Great Britain, and this led to a collapse in the Iranian economy, which fed into popular discontent, and this also contributed to Mossadegh becoming more authoritarian as time went on, and alienating a lot of the key players who had supported his government. So the British and the Americans, who were fearful that Mossadegh was increasingly turning to the Soviet Union, and also to the Iranian Communist Party, the Tudeh Party, for support, decided that they would launch a coup to overthrow Mossadegh. Now, Takeyh makes very clear in this book that despite the myth that this was really a foreign-backed coup that toppled Mossadegh, the real work of overthrowing him was done by the Iranian people themselves. The initial coup attempt, which was in fact US and British backed, failed, and the officer who tried to launch it was arrested by Mossadegh. It was actually the Iranian masses themselves who were increasingly tired of Mossadegh's rather authoritarian style of governance, who took to the streets and brought about his downfall, and it was in the end a rather cunning and rather capable Iranian army officer, Fazlollah Zahedi, who brought about the ultimate coup that led to Mossadegh's downfall. Now, with Mossadegh's downfall, the oil, Iran's oil that is, was put under the control of a consortium in partnership with the Iranian government, and this led to a serious dilution of Britain's dominance in Iranian affairs at this point. They failed to regain the control they had had previously over Iranian oil, and they were forced to accept a new deal in which they were now sharing a lot of the profits with other companies and also with the Iranian government. Now, the overthrow of Mossadegh allowed the Shah, who had never liked his rather overbearing prime minister, to take more power into his hands. But this was a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, it did mean that Iran's government was more centralized, and in some ways, this had its advantages. There wasn't any of the trouble of having to go through a parliament, of having to debate endlessly around certain laws and proposals. And yet, the more power the Shah took into his hands, the more and more the Iranian political system was becoming hollowed out. Invariably, corruption developed as a result of the Shah taking more power, and with that increased power meant that came an increasing amount of criticism from many of his subjects, because the Shah increasingly was seen by the population as being responsible for anything that went wrong, as was only natural. The moment you start to take more power for yourself and to assume more of a role in government, the more likely it is that ordinary people will start to see the person who is in charge, in this case the Shah, as being responsible for not just the good things, but also the bad things. So those politicians, many of them competent and capable and talented men, who had shielded the Shah from a lot of the problems of Iranian governance, were increasingly shunted aside as the Shah now imposed himself as this autocrat who was going to, very much in the mold of his father, drag Iran into modernity. Now, this led to things such as the White Revolution, which was the Shah's program of land reform and was also designed at combating illiteracy among the peasantry of Iran, which seriously alienated, in particular, the clergy, who were massive landowners and who didn't care to see their privileges being infringed in this way. One of the fiercest critics of the Shah at this time was none other than the Ayatollah Khomeini, who would go on to lead the Iranian Revolution of 1979 against the Shah and his regime, and that would bring about Iran's current regime, the Islamic Republic of Iran, which has been such a force of instability in the region ever since. Now, Khomeini narrowly escaped the death penalty for fomenting riots in the 1960s, specifically in 1963, which started in the city of Qom, which is considered to be one of the holy cities of Shia Islam, and which is where many of his followers were based. And the role that he played in fomenting those riots is quite clear in the historical record. The primary sources on this are extraordinary. The defiance of this fanatic, this enemy of modernity and of monarchy, it comes out very clearly in the speeches and in the public statements that he was giving at this time, in which he was threatening to drive the Shah out of the country, telling him that he had learned nothing from the example of his father. The Shah responding in kind, accusing Khomeini and his supporters of being backward reactionaries who were a drag on Iranian progress. And this culminated ultimately in a bloody crackdown on dissent. The Shah, lacking the courage to actually do this himself, relied heavily upon his prime minister at this time, Asadullah Alam, to do the dirty work. And this is a recurring feature in the Shah's reign. He liked to fashion himself as this autocrat, this authoritarian figure who knew what was best for his country. And yet, whenever there was a crisis, for example, the 1953 coup against Mossadegh, he was hopeless. He was weak. He was not able to impose himself on the situation. And in 1953, he had actually fled the country when the first coup against Mossadegh failed. It was only when Mossadegh was safely removed from power that he felt able to return. And a similar situation arose during the 1963 riots that took place over his land reforms. And this is a problem that recurred many years later in 1979, when he was faced with a wave of popular discontent against his regime that led to his being swept out of power and dying an ignominious death of cancer in exile in Egypt, where he spent his final days. It was a dramatic and very tragic end to 2,500 years of monarchy, but it was foreseeable and it was probably preventable. One thing Takeyh makes clear in this book is that far from being simply a puppet of the West, the Shah not only was very stubborn in listening to advice from the West, but he had come under immense pressure for many years to reform his regime, to liberalize his regime, to allow for more democratic freedom, which the Iranian middle classes were increasingly crying out for, and each time he simply ignored the advice coming from Washington. President Kennedy was perhaps the president who did the most in pressuring the Shah to reform. But the Shah wasn't interested. He was far more interested in buying equipment for his army and of getting a blank check for his authoritarian policies. And if he had heeded the pressure coming from Washington, if he had listened to Kennedy and Johnson when they told him that he was spending too much on his army, if he had liberalized earlier, perhaps Iran would be in a much better state than it is today. One thing that became very clear to me from reading this book is that by 1978, it was probably too late for the Shah to do anything to salvage his regime. The clergy had been poisoned against him. Even the more senior clergy, who disagreed with a lot of Khomeini's radicalism, were too afraid to challenge him, because so strong was his hold over the lower clergy that they feared for their own lives and their own careers if they dared to stand up to this firebrand cleric. And so by that point in time, the Shah had alienated so many sectors of the country, the middle classes, for example, the Iranian merchants, the Iranian landowners, the students, the working class, that it's hard to see how he could have come back from what had been many years of corruption, of stagnation, of economic decline, and of authoritarian rule. The bonds between himself and his people had been destroyed, largely as a result of his own stubbornness. And one can't help but think that if he had acted sooner, if he had heeded the words of Kennedy and of other American officials at that time, the disaster of 1979 could have been avoided. And you would not have seen the horrible scenes that occurred immediately after his overthrow. We would not have had the mass purges of his officer corps, the mass executions of the politicians who served him at the hands of Khomeini and his thugs. We would not have seen the development of a repressive religious state ruling over the Iranian people and sending them back into the Dark Ages. We would not see so much of the instability that plagues the Middle East today if the Shah had only heeded the advice that he was being given over many years to change course. And one can't help but be saddened and to think about what could have been had he been more willing to lend an ear to what he was being told. So that is The Last Shah by Ray Takeyh. I highly recommend for anyone who wants to know more about 20th century Iran. I'm currently reading Patriot of Persia, which is a biography of Mohammad Mossadegh by Christopher de Bellaigue. He takes a much more sympathetic attitude towards Mossadegh than Takeyh does in his book. An attitude which I disagree with, because I think that he is actually whitewashing Mossadegh quite a lot in this book. But I'm still in the early stages, and we will see how my opinion of that book evolves as time goes on. So that's all I have to say for now, and I will see you soon, BookTube.